All right, we have a crowd today, so I suspect folks are going to keep filtering in, but let's dig in. Thank you to everyone who is joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn. The fraud of plastic recycling, how big oil and the plastics industry deceived the public for decades. And thank you to everyone who is watching this recording on YouTube. So this is going to be infuriating. Many of the same fossil fuel companies that knew and lied about how their oil and gas products cause climate change have also known and lied for decades about how another one of their core products, plastics, could never really be recycled at scale. It's beyond infuriating. And it could actually be just what we need for the foundation for legal efforts to hold fossil fuel and other petrochemical companies accountable for the deception and the damage that they have caused. I'm so excited to welcome our friends from the Center for Climate Integrity today. They have a brand new report out called The Fraud of Plastic Recycling. And Chelsea Lindsay and Alyssa Johl are with us today to tell us more. I'm so glad to have you guys with us. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate. And MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, our policy priorities, the climate action movement, and more. Thank you all for being part of it. A few notes before we dive in. We will hear from our speakers first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait. You can send questions to me or to Maggie Summers through the chat whenever they occur to you. We'll collect them and synthesize and ask as many of them as possible following the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please reach out to Maggie through the chat. She will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our previous programs, including a few with Alyssa and other folks from CCI on our YouTube page. There are a number of playlists there that can help you focus in on particular topics, and we're always happy to offer suggestions if you're looking for a place to get started. Thank you all for joining us. And Chelsea and Alyssa, I will turn it over to you to kick things off.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Alyssa, did you want to give a little bit of an introduction about CCI and who we are, or shall I jump right into it?
Sure, I'll just say a few words and then we'll start with the presentation. Well, thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Maggie, for hosting us today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. The Center for Climate Integrity is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 2017 with a very single-minded mission, which is to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable for the lies and deception of what they've known about climate change and now what they've known about the plastic recycling, and to hold them accountable for the harms associated with these decades-long campaigns of fraud and deception. And so we're here today to talk to you about a new investigation and a new line of investigation that's underway. And that's what we're going to kick off with today. And I'll hand it back to Chelsea. Of course, if you have any questions about our climate change efforts, we're happy to field those questions, maybe separately offline. but you can always reach out to us.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Linsley. I'm a staff attorney at the Center for Climate Integrity. And I'm going to walk you through the story of how big oil and the plastics industry has fraudulently sold the myth of plastic recycling in order to sell plastic. So first, we'll take you through the story of how the plastics industry created and sold the public on the idea of disposability, which commenced the plastic. Oh,
I just wanted to point out, Chelsea, that the slide that you're showing or your screen share is notes, not the presentation itself.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Is it
There
now? Is it
go.
this?
That's
So it's
great.
Okay.
back
That's
on,
embarrassing.
back in action.
All right. Okay, so since you've already seen my notes, I'll next explain how the evidence that we have that the plastic industry knew that plastic recycling wasn't a technically or economically viable solution for plastic waste. And then we'll walk through how they've deceived the public and continue to deceive the public about the viability of plastic recycling in order to assuage public concern and pave the way for more plastic production. And then to conclude, we'll address some of the costs this has created for communities here in Maine and explore avenues for holding these companies accountable. So despite decades of knowledge that plastic recycling is not technically or economically viable at scale, the plastics industry, which includes some of the largest fossil fuel companies, has sold the myth of plastic recycling to sell plastic. Today, communities are facing insurmountable amounts of plastic in the waste stream and in the environment, and they are sharing the associated costs. The industry's myth about plastic recycling has been enormously successful in paving the way for plastic production. In the past 65 years, plastic production has substantially outpaced the production of any other manufactured material. And of all of this plastic ever produced, about 79% of it has ended up in a landfill or in the environment. Only about 9% has ever been counted as recycled. And the slide that you see here shows EPA data of that, less than 10% ever being recycled. Unlike other materials, plastic is not biodegradable. So once it's in the environment, it remains there permanently. It breaks down into smaller and smaller fragments known as microplastics, and microplastic pollution has become incredibly pervasive. It's in the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe. As you can see from this slide, this has serious consequences for the environment and human health. Plastic is made from fossil fuels, such as oil and gas. Fossil fuel companies are looking to plastic as their sort of plan B to keep fossil fuels in production as the world moves towards cleaner sources of energy. So many of the largest fossil fuel players are also the largest plastic producers. ExxonMobil, for example, is the largest producer of single-use plastic resins, the building blocks of plastic. Just as the fossil fuel industry used its networks and front groups of trade organizations to deceive the public about climate change, they have also operated a network of trade organizations and recycling front groups to spread the myth that plastic is recyclable. And you might recognize some of those organizations on this slide. Since 2010, these companies have invested over $200 billion to expand plastic and petrochemical production in order to pave the way for more plastic production as the world moves away from oil and gas for energy. The myth of plastic recycling is propping up their social license to continue generating ever-increasing volumes of disposable plastic. This is creating and perpetuating the plastic waste crisis that we are living in today. So our report goes back quite a long ways in time to look at the origins of this crisis. This goes back to the 1950s and 60s, when the plastics industry began to promote disposability. At that time, the plastic industry recognized that they had a problem. Their product was actually too durable, which limited opportunities for growth. On the one hand, this was the quality that made plastic really desirable, but it also limited the market and market expansion. So the industry came up with a great solution to achieve market expansion. They would introduce the idea of single-use plastics. If people were to throw their plastic packaging away, then they would have a consistent demand for new plastic. So this was during the post-war era, of course, and people were not used to this idea of throwing things away. But a vital turning point kind of came in 1959 when dozens of children suffocated on plastic dry cleaner bags that companies had previously promoted as reusable. So folks were keeping them in their homes, and these children unfortunately passed away. The industry launched a massive public relations campaign in response to this crisis, encouraging customers to throw away plastics. They made it the responsible thing to do. And this helped them to shift the culture to disposables. But this shift in disposables, of course, created a new problem, which was enormous amounts of plastic waste showing up in the environment. By the late 1960s, the industry was facing public backlash against plastic waste in the environment. So they began to explore solutions to that problem, including recycling. But what they found was not encouraging. As early as 1969 and over the following decades, the plastics industry repeatedly reached the same conclusion about plastic recycling. It was not technically or economically viable to recycle plastic at scale. So first, industry documents demonstrate that the industry knew it was not technically possible to recycle plastic in most cases. The reason for this is that many plastics are impossible to recycle because they're composed of multiple plastic materials that cannot be recycled together. So it would be either impossible or impractical to separate those. Moreover, the quality of plastic degrades as it's recycled. So plastic, which can be recycled, can really only be recycled once. It can't be recycled indefinitely or repeatedly like other materials. So it doesn't meaningfully offset the need for new plastic production. The industry also found that plastic recycling was not economically viable. Recycling plastic is expensive. You have to sort it, collect it, clean it, transport it. And since it degrades as it's recycled, it's of a lower quality, it has limited applications. So virgin plastic, by comparison, is much cheaper and of much better quality. So this increasing production of virgin plastic would continue to compete with recycled plastic and ensure that recycled materials really couldn't find a foothold in the market. Understanding all of these limitations, the industry initially focused on other solutions to plastic waste, particularly promoting landfilling and waste to energy incineration. In other words, burning plastic for fuel. But these approaches did not relieve public pressure on the industry. Incineration is very polluting, and landfilling, of course, has never been a very popular solution to the public. So the industry began promoting recycling, not because it was a good solution for plastic waste, but because it relieved this public and regulatory pressure on producers of plastics. As one industry expert testified to Congress in 1992, the call was to recycle or be banned. So the industry promoted recycling. So yes, they lied. They launched a coordinated, multifaceted public relations campaign to deceive the public about the viability of plastic recycling. Among other things, they launched ad campaigns that told the public, and especially school children, that they should recycle and that plastics could be recycled. And they also highlighted very minor and narrow successes in recycling to make it appear that it was a more viable and widespread solution than it actually is. They also announced unachievable recycling targets and goals with no credible plans to meet them. And they publicized performative investments in recycling research to demonstrate their commitment to recycling, even though they had reason to know that these projects would fail, and all of them did. So on this slide, you see a couple of notes from an industry insider at the American Plastics Council, noting that they were committed to the activities, but not committed to the results of these recycling programs. And they also noted internally that they didn't want to be too open in their communications about their recycling targets, because they didn't want paper floating around saying they wouldn't meet their goals. This was too highly sensitive politically. And they're still lying today. So despite their failure to make any meaningful advances in recycling over the last 40 years, the industry is continuing to promote recycling as a solution for plastic waste. Since China stopped accepting plastic waste imports in 2018, and with the increased visibility of ocean plastics, today the public has become even more aware of the failures of plastic recycling. The industry is facing renewed pressure, and they are following the exact same playbook today. They are launching advertising campaigns telling us that plastic is circular and that recycling is real, despite its very well-known limitations. And they're announcing new and unrealistic misleading targets. For example, to make 100% of plastic packaging recyclable or recoverable by 2030, meaning that it could be recycled or burned for fuel by 2030. And finally, they're publicizing new performative investments in so-called advanced recycling technologies, and presenting this as the new solution that is going to close the gap in plastic recycling. So let's talk a little bit about advanced recycling. What is it? Advanced recycling is an industry-coined term that refers to various processes that use heat or chemicals to convert plastic waste into its chemical building blocks, essentially back into oil. But most often it involves burning the vast majority of this plastic to produce a very tiny amount of unrefined oil byproduct. So these processes require an enormous amount of energy, and they're very dirty. They generate hazardous chemicals and hazardous waste byproducts that impact the communities surrounding these facilities. And typically, of course, those communities are low-income communities and communities of color. So despite industry representations, advanced recycling is not advanced, and it's not recycling. It's not advanced in the sense that this is not new. The most common of these technologies, pyrolysis and gasification, have been around for decades, and they've seen very little success. Industry documents going back to the 1970s note that these processes are inefficient, they're uneconomical for all the same reasons why mechanical recycling is uneconomical, and they are ultimately an infeasible way to deal with plastic waste. This is also not recycling. When people think of recycling, they think of breaking down material and repurposing it into a new product, thereby reducing waste and offsetting or obviating the need for new virgin plastic. But advanced recycling doesn't do this. Most of the plastic in advanced recycling is burned to produce that small amount of oil, which is then burned as fuel. So the industry claims that this oil can be used to make new plastic, but that actually has not been proven to be viable at scale. Several investigations by other organizations have shown that the industry's announced advanced recycling facilities have either shut down or they've never even been built in the first place. None of these facilities are recycling plastic into new plastic products. But nevertheless, the industry is continuing to make advertising claims representing that advanced recycling is viable, that it contributes to the circular economy, and they are continuing this deception that plastic can remain in the production recycle, reducing waste. With that, I want to hand it over to my colleague to talk a little bit about how advanced recycling is being addressed in Maine and some of the costs that this recycling deception has had on communities here in Maine. So Alyssa, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Chelsea. And if you would maybe advance to the next slide, that would be great. Thanks. So I would imagine we were very excited to see when we started to research what was going on with respect to plastic recycling and advanced recycling in Maine, that you all are on the forefront and taking extraordinary leadership on this issue. So I think that's something really, noteworthy and something to be proud of. As Chelsea mentioned, the plastics industry is very aggressively pushing and campaigning to have advanced recycling recognized in places around the country. And they're trying to have this recognized as recycling as opposed to waste management or waste disposal. For very important reason. They want to ensure that these facilities would be exempt from the rules and regulations that apply to traditional incineration or pyrolysis or gasification. And they want to make sure that these pollution controls don't have the same effect and don't apply in the same way that they should otherwise. It's also an attempt to characterize advanced recycling as recycling when, as you've heard from Chelsea, it's not, and essentially greenwash the process, and to claim that it is something that it's not, which would be very problematic. So the good news is that Maine, through this LD 1660, this bill was first introduced in April of 2023, and it just passed and was enacted into law as of this month. But it essentially says that advanced or chemical recycling facilities, if and when they're sited in Maine, will be considered chemical plastic processing. They will not be considered manufacturing operations. And that's really significant for the reasons I mentioned. So any of these facilities will be subject to waste disposal rules and regulations and will not be characterized and constitute recycling. I think you can see in the title of the law itself that advanced recycling does not constitute recycling. It's very clear, it's very pointed. I think what the legislature is doing here is taking proactive action to ensure that the industry can't come in and impose its deceptive tactics in Maine and in a way that would be harmful to Maine communities. So this is a really exciting development, and I think something important to track as it moves forward, if and when advanced recycling does come to Maine. My understanding is that there aren't any facilities as we speak, but that's not to say that they won't be there in the future. If we could go to the next slide. Thanks, Chelsea. I think, it's important, even despite this important development on advanced recycling and the legislature's, preemptive action to restrict the ability of industry to come in, the industry's deception has certainly caused harm to communities across the country and to Maine communities as well. The industry has effectively diverted resources away from other more effective waste reduction and reuse strategies, and has ensured the continued production of plastic waste at enormous and alarming levels. So just to put a finer point on that, I mean, some of the costs that Maine communities are now facing, and this is not an exhaustive or comprehensive list, but I just wanted to offer a few examples. The cleanup costs, as you can imagine, cleanup or recovery of plastic waste in the community, that really has to do with the collection of plastic waste in the environment. When you think about waterways that might be polluted with plastic waste, or public parks and other public spaces, beaches, coastlines, et cetera, there's oftentimes an enormous accumulation of plastic waste that needs to be removed manually. There are, of course, infrastructure and operation costs. As you can imagine, your municipal budgets and management plans account for this. There's a lot of cost and time and resources spent dealing with the increased amounts of plastic waste in our communities at the municipal level. There are, of course, contamination costs when plastic makes its way into the waste stream. unrecyclable plastics in the plastic waste stream need to be removed, and plastic in the more traditional municipal waste needs to be removed. So lots of contamination issues that need to be addressed, and that's quite costly as well. There's public outreach and education that comes, along with this, and other costs that need to be accounted for and addressed. Just to offer one statistic that we were able to find, and some of you on this call might know others, but the Department of Environmental Protection back in 2019, when the Extended Producer Responsibility Program was being negotiated and adopted, they estimated that it costs Maine communities between $16 and $17.5 million each year to address packaging, much of which is plastic packaging. So there's an enormous cost associated with plastic packaging, single-use waste, and all the rest of the plastics that we encounter in our daily lives. And I think it's important to note, I mean, really the report that we put out and the narrative that we're trying to communicate to all of you and to the general public is that the plastic producers who, initiated and have rolled out this decades-long campaign of deception need to be held accountable. Much like the tobacco and the opioid manufacturers or asbestos manufacturers, who also ran decades-long campaigns of deception, all of which exposes them to enormous liability for the harms and the damages. The plastics industry sold the myth of plastic recycling in order to sell more plastic. This in turn created, much higher levels of production and consumption, which has led to a proliferation and inundation of plastic waste in our communities and in the waste stream. All along, they knew full well, they had longstanding knowledge that recycling would never be economically or technically viable, and yet they did it anyway, and they should be held responsible for the consequences. There's a diversity. I'm not going to go deeply into the legal strategies that could be employed, but there are a number of legal claims, including consumer fraud, RICO or racketeering, either at the state or the federal level, and public nuisance, the fact that this has caused an extraordinary interference with the rights that we share as the public. So there are a number of ways in which we can hold these bad actors accountable, and I would imagine that cities and counties and states across the country are starting to explore this as we speak. In fact, the California Attorney General Bonta, has already announced an investigation into this issue, and we are very likely to see action on this front in the near future. So really what it comes down to, and I just wanted to highlight this because I think it's so critically important of what this case theory and narrative is all about. It's all about the industry's false solutions and how they've created and perpetuated false solutions to not just climate change, but also to the plastic waste crisis. The plastic industry has, had longstanding knowledge about the problem of plastic waste, and they haven't really ever denied the problem itself. But when they've learned, over decades of working in this space and in this industry, is when they can no longer lie about the problem, they lie about the solutions. And that's exactly what we've seen in the context of plastics. They claim that, we know that this is a false solution for the following reasons. We know that plastic recycling is not technically viable. We know it's not economically viable. We know that recycling has caused little to no mitigation of the plastic waste problem. And it's been very clearly designed to deceive the public to ensure the continued use of fossil fuels. As Chelsea mentioned, this really is Plan B for the fossil fuel industry as they are, forced to phase out fossil fuels for energy use and energy consumption. They are doubling and tripling down on fossil fuels for plastic production. So really, this work is intended to put a spotlight on this issue and the industry's deception, and pave the way for for real solutions that are currently out of reach. And I wanted to just take a moment and hand it back to Chelsea to talk about what we perceive as some of the real solutions that have currently been shoved under the rug.
Absolutely. So I know most of you are thinking, like, what can we do to solve this crisis? The best and most effective way to solve the plastic waste crisis is to reduce the amount of plastic that is produced in the first place, especially for unnecessary single-use plastic products. There are good examples of legislation that could implement these types of solutions. The Federal Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is an example of legislation. New York has introduced a bill that presents similar solutions that would reduce and ban non-recyclable or easily replaced single-use plastics, and also establish programs that support reuse and refill efforts. So we know the slogan, reduce, reuse, recycle. We say those words in that order because that is the order we should be prioritizing these waste management solutions. We need to reduce the amount of single-use plastics that we're producing in the first place, followed by implementing reuse and refill systems, and letting recycling be the last line of defense when these other solutions are not viable. Continuing to hold plastic polluters accountable is essential to seeing these solutions prevail. As long as they are able to convince the public that recycling will solve our problem, we will not see reduction and reuse prioritized. So we feel accountability is the road to real solutions, and we look forward to an interesting discussion on that. With that, I will hand it back to our amazing hosts for some Q&A.
Chelsea, Alyssa, thank you so much. Thank you for doing this work, for tracking down all of those documents and pulling it all together. And thank you for sharing it all with us today. It's hard to say that because I wish that none of what you just said was true, but here we are. It's better to know than to not know. And I'm really grateful to you for sharing all of that. Just so everyone knows, you will get an email later this afternoon with a link to this recording. You can absolutely share it far and wide. That's one of your calls to action, but there'll be links to help you do a couple of other things. First off, sign up for the Center for Climate Integrity's newsletter. We've been working together for a number of years now, and just really, really have so much respect for the work that the CCI does, and you will enjoy. That might be a strong word. You will be glad that you know the information that they have to share. There'll be a link to this report so that you can spend some time with it and really dig in. And once you do, talk to your local leaders. Have this conversation with folks at the municipal and state level. Do they know about this information? You could be the one to share this important news. So you'll get that in a follow-up email. We have a ton of great questions. I already see the end of this meeting knowing that we won't have talked to about all of them. So I promise we will connect you and try to get as many of them as answered as possible. So diving right in. They knew that it was bad, that plastic was bad for the environment, for our health. Tell us a little bit more about the recourse that we have. And you mentioned, Alyssa, like the tobacco industry. Is that process happening? Where are we holding these chemical companies to account?
Well, I wouldn't say that this legal strategy is well underway yet. I think with these revelations, with the documents that we've discovered, we know that there are more documents out there. So we are committed to uncovering them. there are pathways for holding these companies accountable. And even though that we haven't seen them yet, I think that they will be underway shortly. Like I said, the state of California is investigating this issue. They are very interested in better understanding and finding ways to hold, I think Exxon is the primary target of their investigation, but there are certainly others. But they're looking for ways to hold Exxon accountable for what they knew and how they lied about this. We don't have extensive information necessarily that shows that they knew about the harms of plastic products. What we do have is evidence to show that they knew about that recycling would never be economically or technically viable. So I just wanted to point that out. So I think any legal strategy based on this body of evidence would be, more focused on the recycling lies and deception as opposed to harms associated with plastic products in the environment or in our bodies. But that's not to say that that's not coming as well. I think that is something that many folks are interested in exploring and finding ways to to solve that problem. But there are legal actions that could be brought. I think the opioid cases, the tobacco cases, the many toxic tort cases, MTBE and PCB, they all provide like a template or a roadmap for what this could look like. And it's all premised on looks at the knowledge and the awareness that the industry and the specific companies had about harms associated with their products, or in this case, the fact that recycling would never be viable, but they sold it anyway to consumers. It's about the knowledge and awareness, and then what they did to lie and deceive consumers and policymakers and regulators about the particular problem or issue. So I think that's the nature of the case. This isn't necessarily going to be like a strictly public interest environmental law type case, but we're looking at using consumer protection frameworks, public nuisance, and other common law torts. I think we have lots of information about how these companies and their trade associations and front groups worked in concert together in a very coordinated effort, and that provides the basis for a potential racketeering or RICO claim. So there are some very creative and innovative ways that we could, seek to hold these companies accountable. And that's just to name a few. Chelsea, did you want to add on to anything?
No, I think that really says it. These are certainly very viable avenues for holding the industry accountable.
Thank you. That is really, it's exciting to hear, and really exciting to hear about the creativity going into the strategy here. And I'm already thinking about future lunch and learns. So everybody will circle back on this when there's more to share. With that breach of trust so present in our minds, what kind of advice do you have for folks that, there are all sorts of solutions that are popping up, companies, programs, people who say, you send in your recycling and they'll send you back this product that's made from it. Do you have any advice for folks to sort out whether a particular company or strategy or program is legit, or another one of these sort of greenwashed ideas? And I have a bunch of specifics, but I think maybe I'll start there. There are many people have gotten these pitches in the chat.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think becoming familiar with some of the front groups that, the industry is actually behind. The Alliance to End Plastic Waste is one example that comes to mind of an organization that looks very much like a, environmentally friendly green group, but is really industry funded and is working to advance the interests of the industry ultimately. So becoming familiar with some of those, they're listed out in our report in the back. I think it's Appendix B. Alyssa, I don't know if anything comes to the front of your mind.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, it definitely requires doing your homework and
Yeah.
there are extended producer responsibility programs out there that are legitimate. I know that there was a program and bill that was passed back in 2021 by the Maine legislature to essentially ensure that producers are held responsible for their packaging, including, extensive amounts of plastic packaging. So there are certain programs out there, and I think that that's a good example of one that is quite legitimate and is something that we do want to see. Electronic companies oftentimes have extended producer responsibility where they take back and recycle their electronics, and I think that's certainly we don't want to discourage recycling. We're not saying recycling is a bad thing. What we are saying is that plastic recycling specifically is a myth that was created and perpetuated by the industry, and that needs to end. But I certainly think that there are, lots of good recycling programs out there when it comes to paper and glass and aluminum. I mean, there are extraordinarily high rates of recycling for those products. But really, I think you always want to question what's going on with the plastic recycling, including in your communities, because oftentimes there are, I could imagine cities and towns say that they collect and accept all types of plastics. Well, when in reality, only a very small number and limited number of recyclables or limited number of plastics, and primarily 1 and 2 are ever going to be recyclable. So I think it's important to do your research and to ask questions and to, go beneath the surface when people say that they're involved in a promising recycling program.
Yeah, and it might be helpful just to kind of elaborate on that a little bit. So some of us are aware that when I'm looking for a plastic product near me, when you look at a plastic product, it often has that chasing arrow symbol with a number inside. Those are industry created labels that they have encouraged states to put on to plastic products. So you'll find them on almost all plastic products now, numbered 1 through 7. So plastics numbers 1 and 2 tend to be recycled at higher rates than other plastics, specifically number 1 beverage bottles like your Pepsi bottle or your Coke bottle, and number 2 milk jugs like your standard milk jug made of plastic. So if it's those 2 products, you can feel fairly confident that if your recycling program is accepting plastic, those 2 products will be recycled. If it is not one of those 2 products, even if it's a number 1 that's a clamshell that your fruits come in, or a number 2 that's maybe like a yogurt cup, then you want to do a little more homework to find out if your local recycling program actually is able to recycle that. Because if they're not, it's costing them money to sort that out. If it's not a number 1 or a number 2 at all, that likely is not being accepted by your recycling facility. It's likely not being recycled if it is accepted. So definitely do your homework when it comes to those numbers of products.
Again, this is not easy information to hear. And there are a lot of us who may live in communities where there's sort of single use or single sort recycling. So it's all in there together. There are many of us who live in communities where we're sorting it ourselves at the transfer station. And so digging a little deeper into what happens after we do that step is good advice. And I also heard follow the money, right? Look at who's offering these programs and where their motivations may be from. Let's talk a little bit about the things that do get recycled, which is maybe the plastics that do get incinerated. Will you say a little bit more about plastic incineration and both sort of, we know it's very polluting. Is that because it's not an incomplete burn, or is it additives, stabilizers in the plastic? What's the what's the problem there? And then next part of the question is there a potential for incineration that we haven't explored yet? Or, is there a path that makes sense? Or is it just always bad? That's a lot of questions. I just pulled them all together.
Chelsea,
Yeah,
do
Alyssa,
you,
do you want me to
I
try
think
and
you're
take
better
that one?
positioned to address incineration.
Sure. So I'll premise this by saying we are not experts in incineration technology. They're sort of, I guess, sort of multi-part. I'll try to address each of the parts. Incineration of plastic is essentially burning fossil fuels. So plastic is made from fossil fuels. When you burn it, you're releasing the CO2 in the plastic. So that obviously, given the amount of plastic that's produced, is not an ideal solution at scale, because it would contribute further to greenhouse gas emissions in a very significant way. Second, yes, there are additives. There are chemical additives in plastics. There are a new report actually that's even more recent than ours just came out that documents over 16,000 chemicals in plastics. And most of them, the overwhelming majority of those, have never been evaluated for health impacts. So when we're burning plastic, we are also burning all of those 16,000 chemicals. And the off-gassing that could happen in incineration, we don't know what the public health impacts of that could be. And we know that some of those are actually very harmful chemicals. So to some extent, we know that there are harmful chemicals that could be released when we incinerate plastic. I think those are sort of like the two primary points. Like, is there a way to safely burn plastic? The industry is promoting advanced recycling as the safe way to burn plastic. But what we know is that this also creates, for the exact same reasons, there's thousands of chemicals in these products. You're adding chemicals to break the products down, and they do produce hazardous waste byproducts. So as far as we're aware, there are not really any safe or climate-friendly ways to burn plastic at this time.
So then, if we know that there are plastics that are going to be incinerated when we recycle them, should we be throwing out single-use plastic rather than recycling it? Is that ever the right choice? Or what do we do when if going to the transfer station is on your weekend to-do list, as it is for me, what should I do?
I think this one really comes down to a question of opinion. Like, it's really ultimately not up to individuals what happens with their plastic at the end of the day. If you're recycling your plastic and it's going to an incinerator and you don't want that to happen, then yes, the landfill is a better place for it to go. I personally throw away my plastics that I know are unrecyclable. A covered landfill is right now the best solution that we have.
Oof, no easy choices or paths here. Reducing is clearly the place that we need to be putting a lot of our effort then. And wonder
Yes.
what you're seeing about, reusable containers. Is there something that we should be, we have a comment in the chat about, we should be asking public officials to lead by example and use pitchers of water rather than plastic bottles of water when they're sitting in a panel discussion. Are there other ways to model best practices that you all are thinking about or seeing and lifting up?
I don't know that we're necessarily proposing that on as CCI or putting forward, individual recommendations for individuals along the or policy, positions on this. But I would say to minimizing consumption of plastics. If this is a personal choice and you're able to make it, it's nearly impossible to rid plastics from your life entirely. Like try going a day and seeing if you can do it. It's nearly impossible, even for us who, those of us who are very committed and have the time and the resources to make those purchasing decisions. It's nearly impossible. We are exposed to plastics in pretty much every aspect of our daily lives. But I think that to reduce consumption, to, start to have awareness, to look at the materials that are being used in clothing, cosmetics. I mean, to start to understand like the breadth and the depth that the plastic industry has gone to like infiltrate themselves in our lives. We just don't have choices the way we once did. Of course, we can make individual choices to carry our own reusable mugs or glass Tupperware and, use pitchers in places. I think these are all important ways that we can, on an individual basis, make those changes. But really what it comes down to is that there's a need for systemic, wide systemic change, that we need to see like bans and phase outs of plastics where it's not, necessary to society. I don't think anyone's trying to take away plastic where it's used in medical devices or in hospitals, or, no one is trying to do that. But what we are saying is, the plastic bag bans, of course, we've all heard about the straw bans and plastic bags, straws, packaging. All of that can be addressed. And if we can start to minimize the single-use waste, we've tackled probably 40 to 45% of the problem. I think that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of like how large of an issue single-use waste is. And that was a conscious decision on the part of industry, not on the part of consumers. So I think that the onus and the burden should be on them to deal with this problem.
Are compostable plastics or plant-based plastics part of the solution, or is that more fraught than we would like to think as well?
I think, again, this is another piece that we don't really have the expertise to address, but the compostable plastics, one of the issues that they present is that they're not products that you can put into your backyard compost and have them biodegrade in the way that, your apple cores would. It requires, a system that can process and compost those products. So is it potentially a solution looking forward into the future? Yes, but maybe. I guess I should tamper that with a maybe. But in terms of, is this something that we should probably be cutting out of the system? Is this something that we could be using reusable or refillable solutions for instead? I think, we always want to look back to the reduce, reuse, recycle framework.
So let's talk a little bit about what systemic solutions we are working on and putting into place. So I'm curious about what rules or laws or regulations exist already to reduce and regulate plastic packaging. And I know you mentioned plastic bag bans. Maine has been a leader in so many things, including the plastic bag ban. I don't know about the rest of you, but when I travel to a state and where I get my groceries in a plastic bag, I'm just shocked. Like, how do you live like this? We did away with this. So what else is going on at the state level? And Alyssa and Chelsea, I know you know so much, and you are not working in Maine on a day-to-day basis, but luckily we have one of our very, very good friends, Sarah Woodbury from Defend Our Health, which is a Maine-based organization, is on today, and is willing to jump in and answer some of this question. So Sarah, I'm gonna throw this one to you.
Yeah, I'm going to do my best. As you mentioned, there's the plastic bag ban. Some municipalities have things like straw bans and stuff like that, Portland, some of those places. The extended producer responsibility, that bill that was mentioned, that will hopefully, it's not a ban, but it does encourage manufacturers, industry to move away from like the plastic packaging, because they'll have to pay for the recycling costs and all of the stuff that goes along with that. That they're in the process of doing rulemaking for that now. It should be kind of in effect in 2026. They should have the system up and running. So that will hopefully start to lessen the plastic waste that is coming into the state of Maine, because companies don't want to have to pay for that. I mean, the nice thing about Maine's extended producer responsibility bill as well is that there's some toxics language in there to reduce the toxicity of plastic. As they mentioned, burning plastic reduces a whole bunch of toxics in the air, which is a very bad thing. So that's a good thing. Nicole Grahowski just got a reusables bill passed this session that is going to allow like restaurants and stuff like that to be able to utilize reusable containers, which will help with some waste. Unfortunately, we had a couple of good plastic bills this session that died. We did actually have a bill that would have required that industry label, like a truth in plastic recycling labeling bill, that they wouldn't have been able to put the chasing arrows on their packages if they weren't truly recyclable, if they weren't that 1 or 2 numbered recyclable plastic. Unfortunately, it died in committee, but we will take that up again. So, but I think looking forward right now, the EPR bill is probably the best bill we have, but we'll continue to work with, folks here in the legislature to try to move forward with some more bans on both toxics and just uses of plastics in general. And, if you are in the state of Maine, you should reach out to your legislators and urge them to support these types of policies. And I would also say, if you live in Old Orchard Beach, please thank Representative Lori Gramlich, because every year she puts in like 2 or 3 different bills to try to reduce plastics and has some success, but not all. So.
Sarah, thank you so much for sharing that, and also for leading on so much of this work in the state of Maine. We really appreciate it, and we're going to come back to you again. Chelsea and Alyssa, is there anything else you want to add about state or federal regulations that folks should know about?
No, I mean, I think Sarah covered, well, it inside and out. We do not, but we are seeing similar trends across the country. I would say, you're already ahead of the curve on so much of this. So I think it's something really to be proud of. I mean, I love to hear about that proposal you mentioned, Sarah, about restricting and limiting, placing the recycling symbol on products that aren't in fact recyclable. I'd love to see that move forward and to see that replicated across the country. That would be
California
phenomenal.
actually has a law. We
Oh,
base
they
it
do.
off, yeah, we based it off of California's law.
Okay, that's
We couldn't get it over
great
to that.
information. I mean, I think that's huge. I mean, we have to undo what the industry has done, and that's a really good place to start. So I don't know. I thank you for everything that you all are doing.
I had a hunch, which is being realized, that we have not even scratched the surface of the list of questions. Thank you all for offering such good questions, for engaging so deeply on this. You will get a follow-up email later this afternoon with the full report. You're going to have more questions and ideas after you dig into that, and please let us know. We're always happy to hear what you think about a program, about the policy ideas, and to direct your questions and comments that Maggie and I may not be able to answer to the people who can. Those people are Alyssa, Johl, and Chelsea Lindsay from Center for Climate Integrity, Sarah Woodbury from Defend Our Health. Thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to take next week off, but we will be back in April. And one of our first topics is going to be about breaking out of our silos to help fight climate change. I feel like we might have started that one today. So thanks for helping us get a jump on it. Have a wonderful weekend. It is Maine Maple Weekend, so get out there and have some maple syrup, and we will see you again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.